Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Dr. Gregory Berns.
Well, thank you for coming out. So I assume everyone here is a dog person and dog lover? Fair? Yes, yes, okay, good. Any other animal lovers? Cats, horses, pigs? Yeah. Um, so I have to admit, I always have a problem giving two talks on a very similar topic, and I have this fear that if anyone was at my talk yesterday, I don't want to repeat something, but there are going to be some things repeated. So for those folks, yesterday's talk was really kind of the backstory of what the dog project is and kind of how it got started. And the reason that I wrote this book, the newest book, is in part one of the kind of consistent criticisms of the first one, How Dogs Love Us, is, well, it's a great story. It sounds really cool, but what have you learned about what it's like to be a dog? And so what I'm going to talk about today is actually some of our more advanced findings. So if yesterday was kind of the warm-hearted story, if kind of science geeky oriented, today is even more science. So just be forewarned. And it's not just about dogs, because I've come to think about dogs as actually the ambassadors to the animal world. So the title of this book, What It's Like to Be a Dog, is actually a bit of a riff on a fairly well-known philosophy essay written by a philosopher named Thomas Nagel almost 40 years ago, or over 40 years ago now. And he wrote an essay called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he was essentially reacting to kind of the burgeoning neuroscience of the mid-70s, early to mid-70s, in which neuroscientists were kind of coming on the scene and saying, with all these new tools we have to study the brain, eventually we're going to figure out how the brain works, and we may eventually understand not only what it's like to be a bat, but what it's like to be each other, and essentially how the brain gives rise to the mind. And now what Nagel said was, that's ridiculous. You're never going to understand what it's like to be another person or even another animal, because if you wanted to understand what it's like to be a bat, you would have to be a bat. And of course, if you were a bat, then you wouldn't have any words to describe what you were experiencing, and the whole enterprise is hopeless. So that actually cast kind of a long shadow, I would say, over neuroscience in general in terms of how it became to be viewed over the next 40 years. Is it the fact that we're just kind of tinkering around in brains, whether we're talking about human brains or rat brains or whatever brain you're interested in? Does that get us any closer to understanding not only our experience of being human or our mental experiences in general, but can we even get close to understanding what it's like to be another species? And so what I hope to convince you of in the next 40 minutes or so is that, yes, we are actually getting very close to understanding what it's like to be another animal, particularly mammals, because we're closely related and evolved from common ancestors. So my approach to doing this is to take the tools that I know, which is to use brain imaging, and essentially do the same things that we do with humans to try to understand human brain function, and then apply it to other animals. So first with dogs, and then I'll talk a little bit about some exotic species. Okay, so just quick history lesson of kind of how we have thought about mental experience in general. So this is René Descartes, another famous philosopher. This is a drawing of kind of his conception of the nervous system, which was at the time kind of very fluid-based, literally. There wasn't a conception of how the brain and the nervous system worked other than it was kind of a series of tubes. And he was one of the first to describe this idea of a reflex, where you step on something sharp or hot and kind of this series of impulses occurs that cause you to withdraw the response. Eventually that goes up to the brain. Now, he had, I would say, by our standards, a rather dim view of animals. He considered them automatons without any soul or consciousness. And so he essentially viewed animals as a series of reflexes, but with no awareness of what was essentially happening. And this view kind of continued for quite some time until, I would say, Charles Darwin. So Darwin came along, and he's, of course, well known for his theories of evolution, origin of species, but in actually, I think his most accessible work is one called The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. And his idea, which was, I think, quite revolutionary, is that if we're talking about where emotions come from, he had an evolutionary point of view about it. He said, essentially, that we humans have emotions. They didn't just come out of nowhere in humans, but they had to have had an evolutionary antecedent in other species. And so, in fact, in this book, he illustrated it quite clearly using dogs for many of his illustrations and trying to prove that, in fact, many of the emotions that humans experience are also experienced by animals by the way they express their body language. Okay, so flash forward to the 20th century, and I know I showed this yesterday, but I would say the philosopher Gary Larson had kind of astutely recognized the problems with understanding emotions in animals. So if you can't read it, it says how to recognize the moods of an Irish setter. And I would say the more modern version of it is a golden retriever or a Labrador retriever. And so here's the problem. We all kind of expect and kind of intuit that our pets and animals have these emotions, but of course they don't have the words to describe them, so we project our interpretations on them, what they're experiencing. And this can be very problematic and very difficult because sometimes, like in the case of the Irish setter or many retrievers I know, they don't have a whole lot of range of emotions. They're kind of, as I call them, the Stepford wives of dogs. So what to do? And these are just pictures to kind of illustrate that we have this intuition that this dog is happy, and this dog is sad or anxious or fearful. And this dog, many people would describe as kind of undying love or loyalty to this person. So if these were people, we have two ways of understanding what they're thinking. We can ask them, in which case they will tell us sometimes. So that's one way to probe thoughts. Or we can observe their actions. In the case of dogs, of course, they can't tell us what they're thinking and what they're feeling. We kind of, as pet owners and dog owners, think we know what they're saying and what they're feeling, but in actuality, we're still stuck trying to interpret their outward manifestations based on their behaviors. So this is where I come in and bring in the heavy equipment. That's an MRI scanner being installed in the psychology building, and this is the tool that I'm going to use to try to figure out what dogs are thinking and feeling. Now, what might we find? So before I tell you, I don't know where this cartoon came from, but it's kind of a cartoon map of different parts of a dog brain, so you can kind of get a sense, is this really all that's there? It's a joke. It might look something like this, and this is kind of what we're after. Okay, so real quick, when I started this project, and I don't want to talk about the backstory, but I do want to say that I started this now 7 years ago, almost, and it really was just a crazy idea. Can I train my dog to go into an MRI scanner so I can understand what she's thinking and feeling? Now, for 15 some years before that, I had been doing the same thing with humans, which do not require training, but the idea of putting them in the scanner to try to figure out how the human mind works and how it comes from the functioning of the brain. So when I started this project, when we talk about animal research that usually has kind of very negative connotations to it, it was very clear that we were not going to do anything to hurt any animal. We treat these animals as family members, and so this was the model that I set up to do this project. We weren't going to harm them. It was going to be completely voluntary in the sense that we would not restrain any dog, either physically or chemically. We would just simply teach them how to do this, and they would do it ideally voluntarily and with enjoyment. So we use positive reinforcement, And ultimately, it got big enough where, through word of mouth, that other people started participating, that we could create a citizen science project of volunteers, primarily in Atlanta, to participate in this project to teach your dog how to go into an MRI, so maybe we can figure out what they're thinking. And so these are the community dog parts. Now, there are real challenges to doing this. So if you've had an MRI, you probably did not enjoy it. Humans don't like the MRI because it's very enclosed and claustrophobic, and it makes a lot of noise. Now, dogs react in some ways similarly to that. It's not so much that dogs get claustrophobic, they do react to the noise. So we had to figure out through trial and error how to teach a dog how to do this. And basically what I did was I teamed up with a dog trainer in Atlanta to try to break down the elements of an MRI scanner and teach first my dog each little element, and then we start chaining them together. And so these are just some of the challenges. The fact that the patient table is elevated is an issue for the dogs. So we teach the dogs to walk up steps to go on the patient table. And by doing that, they go in, they know they can go into the scanner voluntarily, which also means that they can leave when they want to. The issue of the loudness, I have a little video, a little clip of how we do this, so I'll just kind of jump to that. Callie is my dog, so she was the first one to do this. And so in this video, you'll see another dog, Mackenzie, who's a border collie. And I'll just jump to it and narrate this a little bit. So this is our training video. And what I want you to pay attention to is just kind of the body language of the dogs, that they are, in fact, enjoying this and having fun. And then, so for the folks who saw this video yesterday, then we'll get to the science. More science. Okay, so this is Callie. This is a mock-up of what's called the head coil. So this is the thing that picks up signals from a person, or in this case, a dog's brain. And so I just made this in my garage. And this is Mark Spivak. He's the dog trainer I work with. And he's using what's called clicker training to teach her to go into this coil. And at this point, we didn't really know if this would work. So you hear the clicker, and then she gets a little treat. And so he's doing what's called shaping her behavior. Coil. Now, Callie came from the Humane Society shelter. She has no particular skills. She's not terribly obedient. But she's curious. She's a terrier mix of some sort. And of course, she likes hot dogs. Yes. So this is Mackenzie. Now, Mackenzie was already highly skilled in agility training. Yes. So this, as you'll see, this turns out to be quite easy for her.
Good girl. Lots. Yes. Is she too far up now?
Yeah, basically, we're looking for the brain thing, yes. The brain case to be in the center of it, right there. Okay. That's good. No, you're not doing this.
Plus.
Yes. So this went on for about half an hour or so, and then I didn't know if this was going to work. None of us knew if this was going to be possible until I saw this. So when Mackenzie did this, I knew somehow this was going to work. The intensity of her concentration and just the border colliness helps a lot. Now she's still moving too much. So then we started doing modifications to it. We introduced this little chin rest, and that gives a target for her to put her head on.
You are perfect. Excellent.
Now,
Perfect.
to give you an idea of what we're aiming for,
Touch.
which is the same as in a human study, we need our subject to be motionless to within about 2 millimeters.
Yes.
They can't move more than 2 millimeters. So this again is probably a couple weeks later. Mackenzie's getting there. Still moving too much, but okay, so I mentioned the noise. So MRI scanners are very loud, And we knew this was going to be an issue for dogs because of their sensitive hearing, but just because it's unusual. So the approach that we took was simply play it at home. So this is me in our basement, and it's just playing at a low volume. These were recordings we made from the real scanner.
That's it. That's what we
And she just got used to it. So here we are at the real scanner. This was actually our first trip to the scanner. We didn't know if this was going to work. And you can see she's a little tentative. She had already been trained to walk up these steps at home and just required a little bit more food motivation. But once she gets up there, you'll see she's fine with it.
Once more? Okay. Come on. Come on. Got hot dogs here for you. Excellent. Oh, good for you. Check it out. Right this way. Callie. Hey, there you go.
excellent. Very good.
On the second trial, Callie went right up the stairs.
Okay, so this is probably after about 2 or 3 months of training. And by training, this is not really that difficult. It's about 10 minutes a day, honestly. So you see, I changed the chin rest so it kind of molds to her muzzle. She's now wearing earmuffs to protect her hearing as well. Since then, we actually switched to earplugs. But she won't wear earplugs, she just wears earmuffs. So we're also using hand signals. So we introduced hand signals because we didn't know if the dogs would actually hear us in the scanner because it's so loud. So we thought, okay, well, we'll use hand signals. This means hold still and you'll get a treat, a hot dog. This means essentially nothing. It's a control signal. So the whole game of doing fMRI, functional MRI, is you try to set up a set of conditions to compare different states of activity or states of emotion in the brain. And so this kind of experiment is what we call straight-up Pavlovian conditioning. This is essentially what Pavlov did 100 years before, except he had a bell. I'm just using my hand. So that sets up a state of anticipation, a positive anticipation, and we know where in the brain that should elicit activity. Okay, so it's the center of the reward system. Now, I talked about this yesterday, so I'm not going to go into those results today because it's not very interesting to say that a dog likes hot dogs, right? We know that. So the whole purpose of pretty much the first year or so of doing this project was to demonstrate first to ourselves and then our scientific colleagues that this will really work, that you can train a dog to go into a scanner. They're doing it willingly. They're doing it as part of a game from their perspective. And we can get enough quality data from their brain to interpret what's happening. And so, in fact, all of that was a proof of concept. Since then, this is what it looks like in the real scanner. That's a different dog. That's another dog, Katie, who appears in many of our videos, and I'll tell more about her. So we wrap their heads to keep the ear protection in place. That's all that is, because otherwise they shake it out. So within probably about a year or so, we had just kind of grown exponentially. And so we had this community of dogs in Atlanta, and we started holding MRI class every other Sunday. So people would come in, we would teach them how to do these various elements, and they would go home and practice with this apparatus. Everyone got a mock-up to practice with at home. And then typically, it would take about 2 to 4 months for most dogs. Once we checked them off in our simulator, then we cleared them to go to the real scanner, and then hopefully everything went well. So many of these dogs are still participating. Some of these dogs, that one dog, Katie, has done 16 different sessions or experiments, and she is probably our best dog. So as we got more dogs, we started to observe interesting things. So we kind of eventually moved away from these very simple reward experiments. And what I want to talk about today are the more complicated things to get at the question of what it's like to be a dog, not just the reward bits. And so this was another project that we spun off eventually. This was a collaboration with an organization called Canine Companions for Independence, CCI. They are one of the largest breeders and trainers of service dogs in this country. And so one of the projects that we did was we had this idea that could we figure out which dogs would be a good service dog. So most of these organizations have success rates of maybe 33%, maybe 50% at best of the dogs will turn out to be good service dogs. And so we started incorporating the MRI training into the dog's service training, and then we could have the dogs participate in an experiment and then use their brain activity to actually create a computer model that would predict whether a dog would be a good service dog. And remarkably, it worked. It worked actually even slightly better than the trainers themselves, their own kind of behavioral observations. This project was actually funded by DARPA of the DoD, and kind of with, I guess, some pride, I tell you this, that it was named by John McCain as the most wasteful bit of Pentagon spending of the year, which he called the Pentagon Puppy Project. Obviously, I disagree with that. But it gives you a sense of kind of the number of dogs and the range of dogs. And one of the things that is amazing about this is you look at these dogs, and these really are the Stepford wives of the dog world. They look like clones of each other. And when you have them in the scanner and you're looking at activity in their brain, you realize that in fact they are quite a bit different than you might think. They're all doing the same behavior. They're all in the scanner. They're all doing what they've been taught. But what we began to find out is that there are kind of things bubbling below the surface, and you can look at specific circuits in the brain associated not just with reward, but things that are kind of classically associated with, call it excitement or maybe even anxiety. And so what we found is that some of these dogs were kind of, I don't want to call it subconscious, but below the surface that doesn't actually result in any kind of behavioral manifestations, that they were experiencing something that differentiated whether they would actually be good service dogs. So, for example, the dogs who had activity in an area of the brain called the amygdala, which is associated with arousal and excitement and anxiety, those dogs were not good service dogs. And so it's kind of the first evidence, I think, that this technique gives us a window into the dog's mind that behavior doesn't. And so from there, we kind of go on to kind of even more complex activities. So this is just a bit of brain anatomy. It's not to scale. The dog's brain is about the size of a lemon. I just want to point out that there are a lot of similarities. So I'm not going to use the pointer. You can make out the spinal cord in the human coming from below, and in the dog it's coming from the right, and that merges into the brainstem. These are called subcortical regions, and they tend to be highly conserved across species, especially mammals. And essentially the structures in these regions are, as far as we can tell, identical. They seem to function the same. The real differences are in what's called the cerebral cortex, that folded part. Humans have a much larger cortex. It's more folded, meaning more surface area. The human frontal lobe starts roughly kind of about almost halfway back. The dog's frontal lobe is actually restricted to about 10% of the brain, so it's much smaller. And this clearly has implications for what dogs experience and for what they can do. So one of the things that we realized, especially when it comes to the frontal lobe, is its importance in what we call impulse control. So we know in humans that the frontal lobe is really all about impulse control, self-control, delayed gratification. And our idea was to try to understand this in dogs, because dogs, to be honest, aren't known to be masters of self-control. Some dogs are better at than others. So we did an experiment called the go, no-go task. And so this is commonly done in humans, and actually it was developed as a study of impulse control in children. And the idea is that you have one condition called the go condition, which is a very kind of reflexive motor response for the subject to do. And in this case, this is going to be a video, so I'm just telling you what you're going to see. There's a dog whistle. So I have a dog whistle in my mouth. We've taught the dogs that when I blow the whistle, they're supposed to poke the target in front of them. So you can see there's a little white target in front of Callie's nose. When I blow the whistle, she just goes like that. That's pretty easy to train. Once the dogs were good at that, we introduced a new hand signal. Not this one, this is a control signal. We introduced a signal that looks like this, which means don't poke the target even when you hear the whistle, okay? So think about that. So that is very hard to do. It's hard for people to do stuff like that, right? And in fact, it took about 6 months to train most of the dogs to do this because it's teaching them not to do something that they've already kind of reflexively learned. And so the idea is, under that circumstance, think of that as putting on the brakes. That should tell us what parts of the brain are involved in impulse control. So here's just the little training video. So that's what she was taught originally. It means hold still, you'll get a treat. Okay, so that, she wasn't supposed to move, so that was called a false alarm. Try it again, and there she did it okay. And then the final one is just the go.
Good.
Okay? So that's all there is to that. And so we did this in our group of dogs, except they did it in the scanner. And so this is why I showed you the picture of the brain. The areas that are colored orange are the areas that are most active. Okay, so this is specifically telling us the areas that are active in this condition where you put on the brakes relative to this hand signal, which means you don't have to put on the brakes because there's no whistle there. So the idea is, in neither case are they moving, and in both cases, they're simply just holding still, but the difference is, in this circumstance, they have the added mental effort of inhibiting this response to nose poke the target. And so the area that shows up when you look at that difference is this area in their frontal lobe. And interestingly, this is exactly the same region that corresponds to the human brain doing exactly that sort of task. So kind of getting back to what it's like to be a dog, the idea that I'm developing here is if you do a similar task, if you do the same task that you do in a human, and you do it in a dog, you adapt it for a dog, and you see essentially the same parts of the brain being active, from that we conclude that in all likelihood they are experiencing something very similar to what humans do in that circumstance, even though they don't have the words to describe it. Okay, so inevitably you come to this problem of language. So again, come back to Gary Larson. This in the business is what we call the ginger problem. So it's amazing that dogs get anything out of what we say, because we humans, we babble constantly, right? And yet they somehow learn some words. And so the question is, what exactly are they getting out of human language? It's very difficult to know. They could be just extracting sounds. Then there's absolutely no meaning at all behind our utterances to them. They are just sounds associated with things that they know. Now we know, for example, that it tends to be easier to teach dogs to do actions, to do things. They tend, as far as we know, not to really understand the names of objects, so they don't seem to know nouns very well. But there have been exceptions to this. So there have been a couple of freakish dogs, we'll say, who have reportedly have vocabularies of 1,000 words. So the most recent one is a dog named Chaser, a border collie who supposedly knows 1,000 words. So we got very interested in this. Could we do something similar with the MRI to understand what dogs are getting out of words? So we basically did something called the Chaser experiment because it was modeled after what Chaser did. It turned out to be really hard. So what we did, we thought this was going to be super easy. These are a subset of the MRI dogs in Atlanta. And what we did was we had the owners teach the dogs the names of 2 objects. These are just objects that we either gave them or they're toys or something new that they had never seen before. And the task was simply first to introduce one object. So I was working with Callie. I had one little thing. I called it the hedgehog because it was like a little stuffed hedgehog. And I would say, hedgehog, and she would have to go across the room and either pick it up or at least, knock it over. And once the dogs learned that, then we would introduce another object which looked different. Maybe it was just like a piece of blue foam or something that just looked quite different. And then the idea would be you put both of them out, you name the object, and then they have to go get the correct one. Sounds easy, and I know everyone here thinks their dog can do it. We almost had a mutiny of our volunteers because to this day, I don't know totally why, but it took over 6 months to get the dogs to even a reasonable percentage correct, which the task itself is a 50-50 chance, right? So our criterion was they had to be 80% accurate before going to the scanner, and it took forever. So what did we find? We're still actually analyzing this, but what I will point out is it took a fairly sophisticated computer algorithm to essentially go through the dog's entire brain and look for parts that seem to discriminate between one word and another. So I should say that when they were in the scanner, they didn't actually go nose the objects. We just had the owner there speaking the words, and so they're just listening to the words. They actually have to kind of yell it to be heard over the scanner noise. And so the question then was, well, okay, first, is there any part of their brain that can discriminate these words? And if there is, where is it? So one possibility would be that it would be in the reward system, suggesting that they just associated one sound with one thing and another sound with another. But in fact, what we're finding is an area of the brain that is kind of analogous to where a human language area would be if it was a dog brain. So it's in kind of what we call the temporal lobe. And so there's this question now. They're clearly using a region that lies in kind of geographic space close to where humans process language. And there may even be some suggestion that they are extracting a bit of meaning out of these words. And so this is really the million-dollar question. When I say hedgehog to Callie, does she somehow kind of conjure up an image in her mind of the object? And that's really what we're trying to figure out, and I think we're actually getting close to that. But the fact that we find this here, again, comes back to the original idea that when we do similar things in animals and we see kind of similar patterns of activation in their brain, it's natural to conclude that they are using similar processes as we do. Okay, so now I want to skip to a different animal. So while all this was going on, it kind of, through happenstance, people, organizations started sending us the brains of animals that died. And one of the first species that kind of made its way into my lab was a dolphin. The technique that we use with these, what we call post-mortem brains, is very different because obviously they're not alive, you can't do anything with them. We use a technique which is called tractography, and it's a way of actually tracing out what we call the white matter pathways in the brain and essentially determining the roadmap of connections. So why is this important? Well, brains, nobody really understands how brains do what they do, but most of us believe that it's the complexity of connections that determines the complexity of mental processes that an animal can do. So humans have a lot more neurons than most other species, and they're highly interconnected. And so by analyzing these pathways, we hope to understand the roadmap that essentially gives rise to, you call it animal sentience, you could even call it consciousness. So one of the first ones that we did was a dolphin. We ended up with the brains of two dolphins that had stranded in North Carolina many years ago, and they were just sitting in a jar. So we scanned them, and what it looks like is this. This is actually a three-dimensional reconstruction of these pathways of a dolphin brain. And one of the first things that we wanted to find out was, what the hell do they do with sonar, right? So there's this idea that dolphins see with sound because they send out all these noises and they kind of construct these mental images. And so there was this idea that the visual part of their brain had been taken over by the auditory pathways. But in fact, what we found was their auditory pathways, which is that kind of little winged area that appears after it rotates around, actually looks very much like terrestrial mammals. And so this is interesting because it gets kind of back to the original question of what it's like to be a bat. Dolphins are similar in that regards. It turns out that they are using structures that we also have, that sonar itself is not that mysterious as people might have believed. In fact, it makes sense because humans can echolocate as well, just not as good as some of those other animals. Okay, so in the last 10 minutes, I want to talk about another animal. And this became an obsession of mine for reasons you will soon see. So I'm going to play you a movie trailer. It's a 2-minute movie trailer.
This is an important job. There's no room for mistakes. The client is after something extremely rare. Got to bring back biological samples. Blood, skin, hair, organs.
I'm Martin David from the university. Where's your father?
Gone away, up there.
You're looking for something most believe is extinct. The rarest, most elusive creature on the planet.
What kind of work was your husband doing up there?
He was hunting a tiger.
You know they don't exist.
My dad saw one last summer. It's a secret.
We went missing last summer. Search and rescue was out for 2 weeks. Not a trace. We get a lot of tourists this way looking for the Tassie tiger.
National Parks found a footprint.
Thank you, Mr. Mindy. I'd like to go on alone. This has all the signs of a tiger kill. She eats the heart first. What do you think happened to Jerry Armstrong?
Slipped, broke a leg, froze, starved.
Jared thought that somebody was following him.
Hands by your side, palms up.
Was someone paying you to follow me?
You said to call if there was any problems. Well, it's becoming a problem.
They send someone to replace me.
They'll send someone to replace him, and they'll keep on sending people until they get what they want.
All right, that's probably enough. The book, The Hunter, is actually really good, and I highly recommend it. As far as the movie goes, you kind of saw all the highlights. Now, why did I play this? Well, the Tasmanian tiger was real, and you could tell from those grainy video clips, which were also real. So there was, actually what you saw, there was an incredible amount of fact in that, apart from the fact that this guy's hunting it for weird reasons. But they really existed. The last known one died in 1936. And I can't remember how I kind of learned about it, but because it's kind of resemblance to dogs and wolves, I became obsessed with this animal. I am not the first or the last to be obsessed with this creature. There is kind of this international, I call it the secret society of thylacines after its scientific name, of people who are obsessed with this animal. And if you go to Tasmania, as I did eventually, many people there believe they still exist, that they just have not been seen in almost 80 years, really. I met people who claim to have seen them. You can go on YouTube and you can find videos of people filming something that looks like that. It's like the Bigfoot of Tasmania. All right, so I became obsessed with it because of their apparent appearance similarity to dogs. But they are not dogs. They are not even remotely related to dogs. They are actually, or were actually, marsupials. So they are more closely related to kangaroos. Meaning, if you go back in the evolutionary tree, the common ancestor between that animal and a dog, you would have to go back almost 150 million years. And so the scientific question here, which I became fascinated by, is if it looks like that, it looks kind of more like a coyote, which is lower left, or a wolf, what do their brains look like? Do they have a brain that looks like a coyote brain or a wolf brain or a dog brain? So I reached out to this kind of weird international community, and there's actually a person who keeps a database of every known specimen from this animal. And I asked him, I said, are there any brains around, like sitting in a jar somewhere? And he said, and he replied back, he said, yes, there's 4. There's 4 in the world. He told me where they are. Turned out one of them's in the Smithsonian, in a vault. And the folks at the Smithsonian were very gracious. Ultimately, I convinced them that I was serious. I wasn't a crackpot, and they lent me this brain to scan. Ultimately, I ended up going to Australia to scan one of the other. So I ended up scanning 2 out of the 4 known brains. And so what did we find? I just want to point out that there's actually quite a bit of rock art about thylacine. So there's a lot of art. So, oh, I forgot to tell you what happened to them. They were killed by the colonials who settled in Tasmania. There was a bounty put on them because they were thought to have killed all the sheep. They were killing the sheep of the settlers, which is probably not true, but nevertheless, they're gone. So comparing them outwardly, you see thylacines or Tasmanian tigers at the top and coyotes below, and they look very similar. This is actually a painting of the ones that were at the National Zoo, one of whose brains is now living in or sitting in a jar. And that's what it looks like. So there's actually, it's a tremendous resource. I actually get to see the card catalog from this specimen that has everything about this animal. So this is what a coyote brain looks like. And this is kind of colored like I showed you the dolphin brain. And you spin it around, and it's kind of this highly connected thing. This is essentially also what a dog brain looks like. So what does the thylacine brain look like? This is what the thylacine brain looks like. And if you look closely, it actually looks very different. It has a completely different organization. The structures are different. The connections are different. And that reflects the fact that it is separated by 150 million years of evolution. And so when we look at these, we start to kind of build up a family tree. And we can begin to understand what these structures do in terms of the functions of a brain, but also the subjective experiences, because we can relate the connections of the living species, like a coyote or a dog, to what we know about their behavior. And then we can reference something like this, which is extinct, and try to understand what that animal's life was like. And we can also compare it to other existing marsupials, like kangaroos and Tasmanian devils. So this has actually led to a project which I'm now very passionate about, which I call the Brain Arc. And it's a quest to kind of digitally catalog all the brains of the existing mammals, especially the large mammals, the megafauna, frankly, before they're gone. And so by doing this, we hope to understand not only where our subjective experiences come from, but also to reference that to the animal world. And so that is the end of today's talk. I have time for a couple of questions, so thank you. Yes, up front. So the question is, to paraphrase, so what did we find specifically about the thinking of dogs? So I only presented two specific studies here. So one is that when it comes to impulse control, that they are apparently using the same structures that a human does. So they're probably experiencing something very similar to us. Also, like humans, the dogs who had more activity in the frontal lobe did better. So this is essentially the same finding as humans, that dogs who have the ability to kind of deploy more neural real estate, if you will, are better at these kinds of tasks. When it comes to language, we're still in the process of that, but it does appear that there are structures, what we call homologous or analogous to human language structures, that suggest that, in fact, they do have some limited capacity for understanding the meaning of words, and it's not just a sound association. So, what else? Yes, sir.
Are dogs self-aware? I don't know how to define what that means, but would you say dogs are self-aware?
So the question is, are dogs self-aware? I would say certainly they're self-aware. And we get kind of into the murky area of consciousness and what that means. But why do I say that with certainty? Well, you don't need a brain scan to know this. So they don't confuse themselves with another dog, right? So they are clearly aware of the physical limits of their body. So that's a component of self-awareness, body awareness, right? I think the question that you're getting at, which is a little bit more subtle, is do they have a concept of self, like we have a sense of I or me? That is a little trickier. So when I call my dog's name Callie, unlike a human, I'm not sure that she equates Callie with a sense of me. It could just be, hey, I better look at the person who said that because something interesting is going to happen. So I don't know the answer to that. If you go beyond a sense of self, so if you go into humans, then you have the capacity of what we call theory of mind, which is the ability not only to have a sense of self, but you also know that another person has a mind as well. And that is one of the million-dollar debates in animal cognition is, does any other species have the capacity to know that another sentient being also has a mind, or are they all automatons to each other? So, yes? What? So, okay, real quick, the question was, did the dogs come to us because of food or because they love us? And so this was very much what I talked about yesterday, and the answer clearly is, at least in the dogs that we've studied, that the social component is at least equal to the food component. I mean, you can't deny that dogs love food. The question is, do they also kind of love the social bond? And there seems to be evidence for that. Can we do one more? 'Cause, yeah. So the question is, say, for example, dogs that will go to a grave of a fallen soldier, and do we have any evidence that the dog's feelings transcend, say, kind of the immediate present here and now? I don't think anyone has credibly studied that. I think one of the overarching things that I've observed now that we've studied a lot of dogs is that dogs are individuals. So even though I'm kind of talking loosely about dogs as a generic concept, they're like humans in the sense that there is a range of capacities for anything we're talking about. So I don't kind of harbor much hope that my dog Callie will go to my grave. But that's not to say that there's some dogs out there who wouldn't. So I have to get pulled off the stage. Thank you.